Oh, everyone is muted. Okay, one more time. Good evening, everyone. We welcome to a seminar with Professor Elliot Wolfson. I'm very glad to have him here joining us from across the United States. I'm very glad to see your names and see you sometimes also your faces and I know that you're all over the United States and maybe beyond. We run this as a seminar. That means everyone can speak, but please wait until we have the question and answer session. And also we would like you to type in your question first, and then we actually will call you. So please all go on mute, except for the speaker who should be able to talk, but everyone else should be muted so that we don't have any background noises. And then we will, in the Q&A, we will have the possibility also to talk. I'm very happy that my friend and colleague, Andrea Cooper, is going to introduce Professor Wolfson. She is, as of this academic year, an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC. And her book, Scandalous Sisters and Sacrificial Mothers in Modern Jewish Thought, is forthcoming, and we're all looking very much reading the book very soon. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Andrea Cooper and for her introduction.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It is an honor to introduce Professor Elliot Wolfson, the Marcia and J. Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Distinguished Professor of Religion at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was previously the Abraham Lieberman Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University, where I had the opportunity to be his student, studying mysticism, philosophy, gender studies, and the history and phenomenology of religion, among other subjects. In his graduate seminars and directed readings, we were challenged and encouraged to refine our analyses and to broaden our intellectual horizons. And I'm deeply indebted to his teaching and guidance, which have shaped my work. Professor Wolfson's research traverses scholarly and disciplinary boundaries, and he has published extensively in the areas of Jewish mysticism and philosophy, in the medieval and modern eras, gender construction and the history of religion, and philosophical hermeneutics and the phenomenology of religious experience. In his 2014 book, Giving Beyond the Gift, Apophasis and Overcoming Theomania, he explores the relationship between monotheism and idolatry in works by prominent 20th century Jewish philosophers, investigating transcendence and immanence in Jewish thought, postmodern negative theology, and apophasis. In 2015, his work appeared as part of the Library of Contemporary Jewish Philosophers in the volume entitled Elliot R. Wolfson, Poetic Thinking. His most recent publications are two more path-breaking works: The Duplicity of Philosophy's Shadow, Heidegger, Nazism, and the Jewish Other, from 2018, which brings to bear Jewish thought, Messianism, and Kabbalistic symbolism on Heidegger's writings and legacy. And Heidegger and Kabbalah, Hidden Gnosis and the Path of Poesis, from 2019, which explores connections between Heidegger's thought and the Kabbalistic esoteric tradition. In his lecture today, entitled Melancholic Redemption and the Hopelessness of Hope, from Kafka to Dylan, he will discuss the messianic belief in a future that may be anticipated, but must be perpetually deferred. It strikes me that Professor Wolfson's locution of the hopelessness of hope and its attendant melancholic sense of postponement speaks particularly to the present moment in all its resonances. So I'm very grateful to him for taking the time to speak with us today, and please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Wolfson.
Thank you, Andrea, for those warm, welcoming words. Before I start, I want to say that I am the one who should be grateful to Andrea, because when she decided to come to the program at NYU to study modern Jewish thought. I wasn't particularly known in that area. I hadn't yet published my work in that field. And it was an act of trust on her part to come and study with me. And I am grateful for that. So thank you. Okay. And thank you everybody who's here, so to speak. And let's begin. In the history of religions, Judaism has been commonly demarcated as life-affirming, a path of piety that promotes the obligation to make the mundane holy, rather than sanctioning the renunciation of the physical. No less a figure than Nietzsche extolled the Jews as quote, and hold firmly onto life, like the Greeks, and even more than the Greeks. It behooves me to note parenthetically that Nietzsche was not consistent on this point, and thus in other aphorisms, he traces Christian asceticism and its denial of this world, especially its negative view toward the passions, to Judaism. Be that as it may, in praising Judaism for its attachment to life, Nietzsche echoed a generalization well attested in Jewish sources themselves. By way of illustration, let us consider the following assessment of the leading philosopher of modern orthodoxy in the 20th century, Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. The one who follows traditional law, or in his nomenclature, the halachic man, quote, does not long for a transcendent world. For was not the ideal world created only for the purpose of being actualized in our real world? It is this world which constitutes the stage for the halacha, the setting for halachic man's life. Far less appreciated is the preponderance of a far more somber view of the world as a place of suffering and alienation that has informed the Jewish sensibility through the centuries. Since late antiquity, the Jews have been depicted as a despondent people, a characterization based on the connection between melancholia and Saturn, and the further association of the Hebrew name of that planet, Shabbatai, and the Jewish Sabbath. In today's lecture, I will argue that the melancholic propensity is particularly evident in the messianic ideal of Judaism, an ideal predicated on the constant deferral of its realization. Translated temporally, Jewish messianism revolves around the axis of a future that can be present only as the future that is perpetually not yet present. Any attempt in Jewish history to identify a particular individual as the Messiah, or any movement as messianic, has been judged to be a pseudo-messianism. This sense of coming that is eternally beyond coming epitomizes Jewish melancholia. I commence with a brief but evocative exchange between Max Brod and Franz Kafka, transmitted by Walter Benjamin. I remember a conversation with Kafka, which began with present-day Europe and the decline of the human race. We are nihilistic thoughts, suicidal thoughts that come into God's head, Kafka said. This reminded me at first of the Gnostic view of life. God is the evil demiurge, the world as his fall. Oh no, said Kafka, our world is only a bad mood of God, a bad day of his. Then there is hope outside this manifestation of the world that we know. He smiled, oh, plenty of hope, an infinite amount of hope, but not for us. With his characteristic penchant for paradox, Kafka equates the possibility of boundless hope with a state of hopelessness, thereby reversing the old adage that less is more by postulating that more is less, indeed infinitely so, as the infinite expanse is reduced to an infinitesimal point. Pushing against Brod's suggestion that his pessimism was reminiscent of the Gnostic view that the world arose as a consequence of the fall of the evil demiurge, Kafka protested that the misery of this world can be explained simply as a result of a bad day or bad mood on the part of God. The distinction, however, is undermined by Kafka's concluding presumption that even if there is an infinity of hope, it does not mean there will be hope specifically for Brod and for himself. Precisely the limitlessness of hope in general delimits the limit of the hopelessness of any individual in particular. One can be hopeful only in the recognition that the fulfillment of the hope one espouses will never come to pass except as the hope for fulfillment. It is difficult to see how Kafka's final assurance to Brod averts the peril of nihilism. Perhaps more tellingly, his words resonate with the experience of countless Jews through the course of history. The particular case of the Jews, however, is indexical of the metaphysics of melancholy that can be applied more universally to humankind. That is, a melancholic state triggered by displacement in the world and the nostalgic yearning for transcendence. If we are to construe the melancholic state as a form of mourning for a lost possession, an idea made popular by Freud, but already articulated by Schelling, then it is a possession that is irrecoverably lost, since it was lost from the beginning. What is absent, therefore, was never present, except as absence. Melancholia revolves around this sense of irretrievable loss, for which there is no reparation or consolation, only illimitable mourning that propagates, in Derrida's felicitous formulation, the law of mourning, that is always in mourning, a law that, quote, would have to fail in order to succeed. In order to succeed, it would well have to fail well. The paradox of success that can only be measured as failure, and failure that can only be measured as success, reminiscent of Dylan's pronouncement, there's no success like failure, and failure is no success at all, is exemplified above all in the aporia that becomes clear when considering that there is, in Derrida's language, no meta-language for the language in which a work of mourning is at work. One is not able to say anything about the subject of mourning, since it cannot become a theme, only another experience of mourning that comes to work over the one who intends to speak. Consequently, whoever works at the work of mourning learns that mourning is interminable, inconsolable, and irreconcilable. The concession that there is no termination of suffering that does not initiate further suffering is the tragic provision that undergirds Schelling's unsettling hypothesis that evil is the most spiritual phenomenon, for it wages a vehement war against all being and wishes to destroy the ground of creation. This inclination underlies Kafka's intuition that even if, or rather just because, there is the prospect of hope external to the world, we will be denied access to it. Here it is pertinent to evoke the insight of Levinas regarding the melancholic rapture essential to the plight of one facing the rustling of existence, or the bare fact of presence that, quote, arises behind nothingness, neither a being nor consciousness functioning in a void, but the universal fact of the there is, which encompasses things and consciousness. In the ecstatic encounter with this brute factuality, which Levinas marks his signature, there is, Ilya, the ego is, quote, is swept away by the fatality of being, and hence there is no longer any outside or inside. The complete exposure to being in the vigilance of night results in the depersonalization of one's persona, the expansion of self through self-contraction. Insomnia heralds the disappearance of every object and the extinction of the subject. Levinas elicits support for the nocturnal eradication of being and the oblivion of self from Blanchot's observation that the night in which nothing is awaited typifies the nature of waiting. Building on this insight, Levinas conjectures that nocturnal time consists of the primordial forgetfulness of self. In another passage from Blanchot, cited by Levinas, the dwindling of self, the waiting for ourselves without ourselves, that is manifest in the inability to say I, is related explicitly to melancholia. According to Levinas's appropriation of Blanchot's language, the melancholic reaction triggers a sense of nausea that one experiences when confronting the nakedness of being, leaving one with the sense of waiting that is invariably a waiting to wait. The lucidity of this confrontation shares with lunacy the stark clarity of acquiescing to the inability to escape from the inability to escape, condemned to stand before the exit from which there is no exit. Like the figure in Kafka's parable Before the Law, only by being consummately outside does one imagine that one is inside. That is, there is no way to be embedded internally, but from the vantage point of being positioned externally. The anonymity of the nocturnal experience is described by Levinas as the return of presence into the void by absence, not the return of something absent that was present, but the return of a presence of nothing present, the reawakening of there is in the heart of negation. This can be compared profitably to mourning without an object to be mourned, the melancholic feeling of bereavement determined by the intransience of there being nothing that can be lost and therefore nothing that can be found. The disenchantment of melancholia on the psychological plane corresponds on the more communal historical plane to the disillusionment of Jewish messianism, and it's propagating an overflowing of sense by the nonsense of the disequilibrium wrought as a consequence of the disconnect between expectation and denial and the ensuing evacuation of the prospect of repair. In Levinas's own turn of phrase, the messianic resolve of awaiting without an awaited is disclosive of the diachronic nature of time as inadequation, the quote, always of non-coincidence, but also the always of the relationship, an aspiration and an awaiting, a thread finer than an ideal line that diachrony does not cut. The insatiable desire peculiar to Jewish messianism reveals the universal cadence of a temporal transcendence that comports paradoxically as the distance that is distant by being proximate and proximate by being distant. The hope imparted by the messianic belief so construed renews itself sporadically as the hope deferred perpetually. Neither pessimism nor optimism seems apposite to characterize the bequeathing of hope through its suspension, a pure futurity that would be compromised if the future were ever to abandon its status as that which is present only by being absent. Every undertaking on this score entails a relapse of what never was, divulging thereby the deportment of time as the recurrence of the same difference that is differently the same, the loop of the double negative that yields the positivity of our becoming the being we are not, a pension well understood through the centuries by mystic visionaries. The philosophical import of the melancholic nature of the asymptotic curvature of messianic time, and by extension of the finitude of temporality more generally, that we adduced from Levinas strikingly parallels the dispirited implication of Scholom's theopolitical Zionism. Of the many pertinent sources, I will cite here from the poem Media in Vita, composed between 1930 and 1933. I have lost the faith that brought me to this place. And in the wake of this forsaking, night is my surrounding space. I'm uncannily attracted by the darkness of this defeat. Since I no longer carry any banners, I'm as honest a man you'll ever meet. Despite, or perhaps on account of, his allegiance to Zionist ideology, Scholom's faith turned, as it did for Kafka, on the bleakness that hope inescapably galvanizes. There is a sense of pride in the honest acknowledgement that he is attracted to the darkness of defeat, having lost the fervor that motivated his emigration to Palestine. Scholom's melancholy is brought to the fore in his admitting that he can no longer carry any banners for the ideology that failed to materialize historically. In the concluding part of another poem composed in 1933, inspired by Benjamin's One-Way Street, Scholem writes, "In days of old, all roads somehow led to God and to his name. We are not devout. Our domain is the profane, and where God once stood, melancholy takes his place." An arresting invocation of the disconsolate disposition that informed Scholom's spiritual sensibility. The sacred has given way to the profane, and melancholia takes the place of the divine. Reality is thus described in the last stanza of Media Vita as that abyss of nothingness in which the world appears. It is probable that this language is indebted to the Kabbalistic axiom that all beings are the manifestations of the concealment of Ein Sof. For Sholem, however, the abyss of nothingness is not an infinite being, the supreme gradation on the ontological ladder, but rather the aggregate of finite beings that constitute the infinitude in the very absence of such a being. The metaphysical distinction between real and apparent is no longer viable because there is no reality behind or beyond the appearance. What is real is the fissure in space-time, wherein the really apparent is apparently real, and the apparently real is really apparent. Schoen's words about the abyss of nothingness bring to mind Benjamin's comment in the theological political fragment that humanity's quest for happiness, which is the foundation of the secular world or the profane order, runs counter to the messianic direction, and thus it is inevitable that the immediate, quote, immediate messianic intensity of the heart of the inner man in isolation passes through misfortune as suffering. The messianic is inexorably intertwined with torment, since it provokes not bliss, but adversity. Insofar as the worldly restitution leads to an eternity of downfall, the method appropriate to the task of world politics is nihilism. Benjamin, together with Bloch, as Sholem judiciously noted, shared what he deemed to be the innately impossible ambition of superimposing mystical experience, understood as an anarchistic turning toward messianism, upon the coordinates of a Marxist system. The hybridity led the two atheist metaphysicians, as Sholem calls them, to retain the melancholic temperament of a Jewish utopianism based on the obdurate impossibility of the future and the non-eschatological nature of the eschaton. History does not progress toward any end, nor is the anguish of time alleviated by divine fiat. And just as there is no advance to a utopia at the end, so there is no return to a paradise at the beginning. The psychogenic structure of melancholia, consequently, does not entail the retrieval of a lost object, a la Freud's discussion of the abandoned object cathexis, that is, the response to a loss that redirects the allocation of psychic energy from the external entity to the internal space of the ego. Melancholia is the absence of such an absence, and the consequent discovery that there is nothing to discover and hence nothing to recover. The melancholiac is marked consequently by an inability to speak because there is nothing of which to speak, not even the unspeakable. Julia Kristeva thus delineated melancholia as, quote, a non-communicable grief that at times and often on a long-term basis lays claim upon us to the extent of having us lose all interest in words, actions, and even life itself. Expressing a similar viewpoint in her analysis of Freud, Judith Butler wrote, "What cannot be declared by the melancholic is nevertheless what governs melancholic speech, an unspeakability that organizes the field of the speakable. What the melancholic does declare, namely his own worthlessness, identifies the loss at the sight of the ego, and hence continues to fail to identify the loss. Self-beratement takes the place of abandonment and becomes the token of its refusal." Schoen's youthful gloom became critical in his more mature understanding of the messianic element in Judaism, and in his use of the term Gnostic as a tool of historical and phenomenological inquiry of Kabbalistic sources, especially the depiction of the cosmic drama as a crisis within the inner workings of the Godhead, according to the Lurianic teaching and its elaboration in the heretical myth of Sabbatian theology. For our purposes, I want to focus on Schoen's celebrated remark that the messianic idea in Judaism, quote, compelled a life lived in deferment, in which nothing can be done definitively, nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. This statement is indicative of a pessimistic utopianism that rejects the possibility of socio-political redemption. Scholem remained beleaguered by a sense of disjointedness in the world that was askew with his ethno-nationalist politics, a melancholic dislocation that led him to feel like a stranger in a strange land, even when entrenched in the soil of what he demonstrably considered to be the Jewish homeland. To be sure, Sholom's understanding of the Messianic as continual deferral has deep roots in Jewish sources, but his particular formulation is in accord with another passage from the Theological Political Fragment, where Benjamin writes that since the Messiah alone can redeem and complete history, nothing historical can relate itself from its own ground to anything messianic. Therefore, the kingdom of God is not the telos of the historical dynamic. It cannot be established as a goal. For the standpoint of history, it is not the goal, but its terminus. Sholom's interpretation of Jewish messianism, especially as it intersects with Florianic Kabbalah and its aftermath in the Sabbatean and Frankist movements, is faithful to Benjamin's insight that messianic redemption is not the goal of history, but its end. And hence the method most appropriate to world politics is the nihilistic passing away of nature. The messianic objective on this account is not to be achieved at the cessation of history. It signifies rather the relentless deterioration of just such an objective, which is indicative of the eternal fleetingness of history, a notion that pivots around the paradox of time as the present that is always the same in virtue of never being the same. Sholom insists that the constant postponement of messianic redemption, what he calls the anti-existentialist idea, accounts for both the greatness and the constitutional weakness of Jewish messianism. Whenever the tension between the expectation and the delay has been alleviated by an actual messianic movement, when the abyss that separates the eternal symbolic and the external historical has been crossed, it has been decried or unmasked as pseudo-messianism. In the continuation of the essay from which I cited previously, written in 1959, that is the idea of the messianic idea in Judaism, this only 14 years after the end of the Second World War and 11 years after the establishment of the modern state of Israel, Sholom bluntly acknowledges that the implementation of the Zionist dream may have been born out of horror and destruction, but it jeopardized the meta-historical and anti-political nature of traditional Jewish eschatology, thereby compromising its anarchic and antinomian lifeblood. Sholom thus wondered if Jewish history, quote, will be able to endure this entry into the concrete realm without perishing in the crisis of the messianic claim. The hopelessness of hope proceeds from the fact that the future we are awaiting can never transpire in time, and the homeland we are coveting can never materialize in space. And with this insight, we come finally to Dylan. It is my judgment that this sense of melancholia has sustained Dylan's poetic vision through the decades. As he wrote in Night After Night, 1987, night after night, some new plan to blow up the world. Night after night, another old man kissing some young girl. You look for salvation, you find none. Just another broken heart, another barrel of a gun, just another stick of dynamite, night after night. In the nocturnality of exile, one rummages for redemption, but comes up empty, compelled to undergo more heartbreak. However, in this brokenness, we remain unbroken. In the ability to find salvation, we are saved. Time constraints preclude me from entering into a detailed analysis of Dylan's songs, poems, and prose. By way of generalization, however, I propose that Dylan has been acutely attuned to the apocalyptic component of Judaism discussed above, an orientation that incarnates the infinite negativity of time. That is the impossible possibility of a future that makes it continually possible, indeed necessary, that the future that is coming threatens not to be the future that has been anticipated. From the beginning of his career until the present, Dylan has been fascinated with the torment of suffering, loneliness, desolation, and the ephemerality of all things. Consider the sentiment expressed in This Dream of You from 2009. There's a moment when all old things become new again, but that moment might have been here and gone. The hope for a moment of renewal and restoration shattered by the realization that even that moment inevitably is subject to perishing. Note the opening lines of I Contain Multitudes, the first song on Rough and Rowdy Ways, the album that was released this year. Today and tomorrow and yesterday too, the flowers are dying like all things do. Not the most sophisticated rhyme ever written by our Nobel winner in literature, to be frank, but one that cuts to the bone with its childlike honesty about the resilience of transience. In Crossing the Rubicon, another song from this album, Dylan lays bare his consternation and the need to keep up the fight, no matter how useless. What are these dark days I see in this world so badly bent? How can I redeem the time so idly spent? How much longer can it last? How long can this go on? I embraced my love, put down my head, and I crossed the Rubicon. Even the hope for salvation is viewed skeptically by Dylan, as these words from an alternate take of Shelter from the Storm, 1974 attests. Now the bonds are broken, but they can be retied by one more journey to the woods, the holes where spirits hide. It's a never-ending battle for a peace that's always torn. A peace that is always torn. No expectation for an ultimate mending or reconciliation. One may deduce from Dylan's work that he does not view redemption as the outcome of historical development, the effect of a causal chain that links the retention of the past and the protension of the future, but rather as the corollary of an expectation that is realized as the expectation of what cannot be realized. Repeatedly, Dylan affirms that the homelessness of being at home converges with the homeliness of being banished from home, and hence the possession of the dispossessed cannot be disentangled from the dispossession of the possessed. How does it feel, he famously asked, in what is arguably his most celebrated song, to be on your own, with no direction home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? Expressing this sense of destitution many years later, in Abandoned Love, 1975, Dylan writes, I've given up the game. I've got to leave. The pot of gold is only make-believe. The treasure can't be found by men who search, whose gods are dead, and whose queens are in the church. The dark vision is one of the prevailing elements of Dylan's poesis, rooted, I surmise, in the long-standing Jewish penchant for melancholia and the related Gnostic suspicion about the plausibility of finding redemption in the world, wherein he forthrightly expressed in 1999, everything is broken. In Shelter from the Storm, 1975, he poignantly communicated the futility of life in this way: while the deputy walks on hard nails and the preacher rides a mount, but nothing really matters much, it's doom alone that counts. I've heard newborn babies wailing like a mourning dove, and old men with broken teeth stranded without love. Do I understand your question, man? Is it hopeless and forlorn? To make matters worse, we are told in the same song that bargaining for salvation leads to getting a lethal dose and the offering up of innocence to being repaid with scorn. The melancholy of Jewish messianism procures this certitude of endless doubt, the questioning of the questioning that elicits no response but another question seeking a response. As Dylan agonizingly proclaimed in Things Have Changed, 1999, all the truth in the world adds up to one big lie. One is reminded of the words of the psalmist, Psalm 116, I trust in the Lord, out of great suffering I spoke, and said rashly, all men are false. Or in the searing explanation of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, utter futility, all is futile. What real value is there for a man and all the gains he makes beneath the sun? Wisdom may be superior to folly as the light is superior to darkness, but ultimately the same fate of mortality awaits the wise man and the fool. There is no advantage of one over the other, as they are equally vain and ineffectual. Although as moral agents we must discriminate righteousness from wickedness, closer scrutiny reveals that the humans and the beasts suffer the identical destiny. Both amount to nothing as they come from and return to the dust. Chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. Dylan's despair over the human plight is in accord with these scriptural formulations. Prima facie, there is no sustainable benefit for our toils and tribulations. Our endeavors, as well intended as they may be, are pointless, like the pursuit of the wind. Surely one can hear a reverberation of this fatalism in Dylan's insistence in It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, that, quote, not much is really sacred, and that, quote, it's only people's games that you got to dodge, since, quote, all is phony. Many have opined about Dylan's Jewishness, but few have heeded the fact that the melancholic view of the world may be the element of Judaism that has most consistently kindled his creative impulse. By unveiling the veil of dejection spread over nature, the deep and indestructible melancholy of all life, to paraphrase Schelling, we comprehend that joy must have suffering and that suffering must be transfigured into joy. The Jewishness of Dylan's artistic genius, it seems to me, is expressed above all in his unwavering effort to accomplish such a transmutation. I can well imagine that Dylan would concur with the version of Melancholic Redemption proffered by Leonard Cohen, his fellow taxonomist of sorrow. And even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of song with nothing on my tongue but hallelujah. The liturgical gesticulation ensues from the fact that everything has gone poorly and not from the fact that everything has gone well. This, I suggest, holds the key to understanding an essential feature of Jewish humor, but that is a topic for another day.
Thank you so much with this light note at the end. I would like to encourage everyone who has questions, at least put a quick question or something in chat or raise your arms. We try to find you. We are just so many that we don't see everyone immediately, but I would really like to hear from you and encourage you to ask and put questions. Kada,
Hi. I thought I would jump in here right at the beginning before other people get a chance to collect their thoughts, even though my question is also not formulated enough yet. So thank you so much for this wonderful lecture and bringing in so many beloved thinkers like Kafka and Freud and Dylan and others. So my question is, the idea that you were tracing, or at least that I was understanding as you went along in your lecture before you got to Dylan, was an idea, what you aptly call the hopelessness of hope, or which in my sort of own mental formulation about it was sort of about the way that messianic hope always involves, because it always involves this act of deferral and of never arriving, that it's always bifurcating, right? Sort of that messianic hope or messianic deferral always kind of contains both the idea of hopelessness and hope in it. And so my question is really a very simple one, which is, I didn't see precisely that concept, which was really crystallizing for me until you got to Dylan, carried through to the Dylan, right? Because when you talked about Dylan, I just saw a sort of more general comment about the very prevalent, the prevalence of hopelessness and despair in his lyrics. And so I was wondering if the more sort of specific thesis that you were developing can be traced to Dylan.
Well, I think so. That's what I was trying to argue. But by the way, I left out a section which actually resonates very much with what you were saying in terms of it. There's a kind of double-edged sword here, right? That the future is always deferred can seemingly be a source of hope. You get that in Derrida. Derrida's idea of mechanicity, which is predicated in a similar way as Levinas on the fact that the future is always to come. But at the same time, that can also engender despair, that deferral. So I think it does go both ways. Now, in terms of Dylan, what I was trying to argue is that he picks up very much on this sentiment of what I call melancholic redemption. That is, through the artistic expression of the suffering, there is some kind of transmutation or transformation of it, but never in a blindly optimistic way. we never get it with Dylan. You know, maybe in I Shall Be Released. That's one song which is interesting in that regard, because I Shall Be Released seems to really express a desire for deliverance and a hopefulness without it being tinged with the hopelessness. But that seems to me somewhat of an anomaly when you look at his corpus as a whole. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, are there any other questions? Or you can also just unmute yourself and start to talk. I think we're not, that should be easy too. So Casey, do you want to ask your questions?
I did see.
Okay, if you want me to.
Yes, please.
Yeah, let me make myself visible too. So I had a little trouble following until you got to Dylan, and then it was a little easier. But my feeling is that, you see, if people are really thinking deeply, they're bound to be disappointed, right? Because what you really want, this great goodness or redemption, we will never get there. So wouldn't it be wiser just to live in this world that we're in and not worry too much about that goal?
Well, to quote the Stones, whatever gets you through the night. Oh no, was that Lennon? Maybe that was John
Lennon.
That was John Lennon. My apology, John Lennon. What could I say? Sure, if that works. But I'm not willing to go as far as Nietzsche to say that all creativity is reflective of this melancholia and this sense of suffering, but a lot of it is. Right, a lot of it is.
Yes. And I'm not saying we shouldn't keep trying, but just accept that we'll never quite get there, but it's good to keep trying.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree with you. I mean, that's what I said, that it seems to me that what Dylan is doing is trying to transpose or transform the suffering into joy, but never to get to a point where he affirms a sense of joyfulness that has completely overcome the suffering.
Right.
All the truths in the world add up to one big lie. Imagine, I used to listen to Dylan as you know, as a teenager. Imagine how hard it was to get out of bed. But that line, was you know, more recent, so I was older. But just imagine, you know, all the truths in the world add up to one big lie. What a dark vision that is.
Yeah.
And I think Sierra, do you want to read what you just posted to everyone?
Yeah, so the Stones quote I tell my students teaching them theory is, you can't get no satisfaction, because it's not about your satisfaction, it's about the act of thinking critically, hopefully for the community you are endeavoring to study and not for your own satisfaction. So I guess I'm wondering, I want to hear more about presence defined by absence as the renewal of a hope for presence that perhaps is its own sort of creative presence in itself, which I think is from the beginning of the talk, what you were saying about shelling and evil as the most spiritual thing. So
yeah.
it's on my mind.
Well, I agree with you about the stones, although I'm not sure you can always get what you want either. but with that caveat, yeah, I accept that. So I lost the thread a bit of your question. I'm sorry.
Just the definition of presence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was my implicit critique of Freud, actually, because Freud's understanding of mourning and melancholia, there is a lost object that is retrievable. So to translate it into the language of presence in order to answer your question, it would be the possibility of retrieving a lost present and making it present again. And what I was arguing, that melancholia is actually an absence of absence because there never was a presence. So to me, that's kind of the I don't know for the right word here, but the depression or melancholia really may be more about the feeling that there never was anything present, that there is nothing to recover or discover. Now, Levinas is interesting on this, right, accord, because it's that insomnia in the night, which he uses as a way to express the encounter with the there is, with being. But even for Levinas, and maybe Andrea or somebody else will correct me if they feel differently, but it doesn't seem to me that for him that Ilya or there is actually a presence either. Right? It's at the heart of negation, I think I said at one point. It's right.
Thank you. I have now several people who raised their hands. They use the blue button or have sent me questions in the chat. I would first like to start with Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elliot. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is the way Dylan relates to love. It sounds very redemptive, but it actually, if you look closely, like at a song like Mississippi, which actually I think is maybe underrated because just the lyrics are capturing exactly what you're saying, which is love would be, I think, akin to the way we're referring to joy in the Hasidic sense. It's fleeting, it's temporary, but we treat it like redemptive. But I'm wondering if you've thought at all, maybe it'll help if I just read. He says in Mississippi, I know that fortune is waiting to be kind, so give me your hand and say you'll be mine. The emptiness is endless, cold as clay. You can always come back, but you can't come back all the way. I mean, he's treating love as this redemptive thing, but I think he knows it's not.
Oh, I totally agree with you. That night, I started with Night After Night. That's the same deal. Yeah, no, I fully embrace what you're saying. Yeah, I don't think he sees in love ultimately the possibility of a redemption from the suffering. On the contrary, actually. Yeah. I'll tell you something anecdotally, which is interesting. One of the times I saw him, I think it probably was around 1999 or something, and it was in Madison Square Garden, and it was a lot of people, right? And he said before he did a song, he goes, "This is a song that I usually do when I'm alone, but I pretty much feel alone right now." And I thought, you know, he doesn't talk that much anymore, but he used to say things. So I thought it was a very interesting comment. You know, here he is on stage, thousands of people, and yet what he felt was that sense of loneliness. Yeah, but I agree with your comment about love. Yeah. Thank you.
Nathaniel, you wanted to ask a question.
Yes. Elliot, thank you for that amazing talk. And I really look forward to studying it. I think it's a text that really needs to be studied, and I look forward to seeing the written copy. I just wanted to make two comments that, one a comment and one maybe a question. One is that the line that you quoted from Leonard Cohen is one of my favorite lines in Leonard Cohen, and was especially important to me when I was finishing St. Kaddish at the end of the year of St. Kaddish for my mother. And there's something about that line that I feel like it doesn't quite fit into the hopelessness thing. And I don't know, it doesn't seem to land anywhere. I mean, or it lands in the paradox, or it lands in the movement. Not sure if it lands in Melancholy when he says, "I stand before the Lord of song, nothing on my lips but hallelujah." I'm not sure if it lands on Melancholy. Anyway, it's just a thought about whether that fully enters into this into this formulation. And then the second really is maybe a very marginal question to your paper, which is very briefly when you're quoting Shalom, you know, he makes his offhand invidious reference to existentialism, and as he sometimes do in his work. And I never feel like I'm not really sure who he's talking about, because it's not really the existentialism I recognize. And he attributes it kind of a be here now kind of philosophy, it seems like. And it's not the work I recognize in Heidegger or Sartre, or really, or certainly not Kierkegaard. And I wonder what role that, like, the way existentialism plays that role of whipping boy and Shalom every once in a while, and that goes really to some of the central questions you were raising today. Because I would read existentialism as very much in the line of the kind of paradigm you were presenting. So just two thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. So for the first one, I agree. I mean, I brought in the Leonard Cohen at the end. I think they're much better locations in Cohen's work to show his own struggle with melancholia. I don't so much see it here. However, I mean, he does say, even though it all went wrong. That's not necessarily melancholy, but that's a kind of grim view, right? It all went wrong. It's pretty categorical, right? All went wrong.
But hallelujah.
Even so, exactly, that's the point. Even so, I'll stand before the Lord of song. And the second one, that's an interesting question that I really need to reflect more about. But I quite agree that I don't think he has a deep engagement with existentialism. So then the question is, what is in the environment, his environment, and what is he exactly responding to? I mean, there's I'm blocking on the name. I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of the well, there's Rothenstreich that he was obviously engaged with, and you know, there's a long communication with Adorno. I mean, some of these things may have come to Sholem through these channels. I don't know, Nathaniel. I have to think more carefully about your question. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe, I have two more people who wanted to ask questions, and I would I'd like to first ask Isaac to ask his question.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful talk.
Yeah.
Nice to see you virtually. I would certainly agree that on whatever depression scale you want to come up with, Dylan is way ahead of Cohen, if you look at the overall metrics. What is the role of the Eden story? Does it suggest recoverability or that nothing is recoverable?
The Eden story for Dylan or just in general?
Okay, now let's just, in general,
In general?
or Jewish thought, or from your perspective.
Yeah, well, so let me see if I understand. So you're asking me if the narrative about the Eden story offers some sense of retrievability to get back to the
Right.
get back to the garden.
We can go to Joni Mitchell. Are we trying to get back to the garden? And does that indicate that maybe there is some hope?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, right? Let us renew the days as of old. So there is what Shalom called the restorative, right? He used that language. There is a restorative element in Jewish sources, a return to paradise, to be sure, and that is worked out and expressed in different ways. But I guess from my vantage point is, the famous letter of the Baal Shem Tov and right meeting the Messiah, and remember the first word of his question, Ad matai, right? Until when? Right? So I guess my question is, yeah, you have that element, that component, but if it's perpetually deferred, then it breeds this sense of, it can breed this sense of melancholy.
If you assume perpetuality.
Yeah. Right. Now, I picked up on that theme because, I mean, there are so many other thinkers I could have discussed, and it may have come out differently. So I tried to follow a trajectory here, starting with Kafka and going to Dylan. But the thinkers that I did invoke, all one form or another, seem to assume that perpetuality of deferment. Right? Like Sholem, the messianic idea is a life lived in deferment. He says it explicitly.
Thank you. And for our one more question is Elizabeth, who raised her arm.
Hello, thank you, Elliot, for your talk. Since you did mention Levinas, I'm curious because the insomnia of the Ilya of the There Is in his early work. And if I remember this correctly, it pretty much disappears almost from his concerns. I may be wrong about that, but where the insomnia then later on reappears is that the other leaves me insomniac. In other words, the infinite call, as it were, is in the face of the other. And it seems to me that there is that's a real, this whole melancholia for Levinas, in any case, of the Ilya. At least, I may have a memory lapse here, but it seems to be replaced by the urgency of the call of the other, where, you know, this, where everything basically loses, everything else loses importance.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that, reminding us of that, reminding me of that. I agree. But I would say at one point, the characterization of the future, the diachronic nature of the future, as he relates it to messianism, is expressed in the formulation of awaiting without an awaited. And that's in later works. That echoes the earlier work when he was using Blanchot, and a lot of Blanchot's formulations about waiting. So at least that element he seems to have retained. But I thank you for your comment. I think I need to nuance the discussion of Levinas better in light of that comment. So thank you.